Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Jedi Talk. I am your host, Brad Hughes.
I'm your co-host, Evan T. Boucher.
And I'm Erica Sherman.
Yay, we're all here. And we are joined by a very special guest today. During this quarantine lockdown, Kevin Shinick, the Emmy Award-winning author of the book Force Collector, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Kevin, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you very much. I'm happy. I want to say I'm happy to get out, but we're all stuck in.
Exactly.
Are you going stir crazy?
You know, I'm not stir crazy. It's just that I have a 9-year-old daughter, so, there's anything but boredom over here. We've got homeschooling. We got all sorts of stuff. So, yeah.
Nice.
I'm not saying it's the best of times. I'm saying we're not bored.
Well, not bored is good. So we're here to talk about your Star Wars book, Force Collector, which is honestly, and I've said this, you can go back and listen to the podcast, and we did a review of this book. It is one of my favorite Star Wars books ever written, and I've read a ton of Star Wars books. For some reason, I've become like the Star Wars book guy.
Yeah, you really have. Like, it just kind of like organically developed that way. I haven't read as many as you have, but Force Collector is my favorite Star Wars book.
And I just kept raving about this. And it's just such a unique... I loved it because it does what I think expanding the Star Wars universe should do, which is create new and interesting characters, also while tying in things that are familiar, but not in a forceful way. No pun intended. And I think this book just did a great example of that.
I appreciate all of that. I'm so glad you guys enjoyed it, and your praise means a lot because it's, I am also a Star Wars reader, and when I sit down to do anything, whether I'm making shows or writing books, I approach it first and foremost as an audience, and I want to be entertained. I want to enjoy what I'm reading. So when I sit down and write it, I always think like, well, what kind of book do I want to read? What kind of ties do I want to make, with these stories and whatnot? And that's kind of how I approached it. So to hear you say that as a reader, I really appreciate that.
Oh, I appreciate how good this book was, man. Evan, you had a few questions you wanted to ask him up front, and then I'll kind of go through my little questions here, but I want you to get yours out first because you missed out on the last interview we did.
That is true. I'm so glad I can make this one for a multitude of reasons, but I don't know. I think what I really liked about this book, most of it we've already said, I just love how you connected it and used references to not just like the current canon timeline, but also like other Star Wars media, like from comics to TV shows to movies. You've got a little bit of everything in there, and it isn't just those medias either. You've hit every single era. You have stuff from the prequels. You have stuff. It takes place during the sequel trilogy. You have original trilogy references. So the way that you just tied everything together, like, is what really made me love this book. And I don't know how much of that was just from your own imagination or how strictly tied you were to set guidelines, but I really did enjoy and love what you did with that stuff.
Oh, I'm so glad because that was a huge endeavor. As you can imagine, when you sit down to write something like this, the possibilities are limitless. And then it becomes like, well, how long do I want this book to be? And also, what are my top 10 places I want to visit? Because I said this before, but there's a fine line between, as you guys just said, like you are the Star Wars book guys. I obviously have a deep history in Star Wars. Just a quick rundown back. I wrote Chewie and the Porgs, which is a children's book.
Love that book.
I was on. It was a lot of fun doing that. I write and produce Robot Chicken, so we have all those Robot Chicken Star Wars specials, which are more adult. And I actually worked with George Lucas on that Star Wars Detours, which was his idea of a Star Wars sitcom.
No way! You worked on that?
Yeah.
Whoa.
So, like, I mean, the tale there goes that we wrote 3 seasons completed, 2 seasons produced, and then George sold the company, and they were, and Kathleen at that point, and I got to say, in hindsight, rightly so, she shelved it because this is just my take. But when Disney bought the company, all roads led to Episode 7. That's all that mattered.
Yeah.
So they weren't going to put something out prior to that wasn't Episode 7 or of the ilk of Episode 7. And now, while Disney had nothing to do with Star Wars Detours, George had a definitive style that he wanted to go up with animation that I think people would have thought was exactly the problem that they feared would happen if Disney took over Star Wars.
Yeah,
Does
I
that
could
make
see
any
that.
sense? Like,
yeah,
it was
no,
a
I could
cutesy
definitely see that.
version, and
Yeah.
I fear that if Kathleen had let that go then, they'd be like, oh, this is what I didn't want to happen if Disney took over Star Wars, and yet they had nothing to do with it. So
Yeah.
I understood why she put a pin in it, and then in that same vacuum, I think Star Wars Lego kind of came in and filled that void of comedy animation for Star Wars. So, maybe we'll see it one day, but it sure was an amazing time, an amazing project to work on. And I literally got to work up at Skywalker Ranch for about a month with George, sitting literally next to him, pitching story.
Oh.
And I said this before, I'm glad it was so many weeks, because for the first 2 weeks, I didn't hear a word the man said, because every time he opened his mouth, I just kept saying, you made Star Wars, you made Star Wars, you made Star Wars. So it was tough to make him human. And then eventually he became human, and you're like, oh, okay, good.
That's awesome.
But anyway,
man.
I get away from your question, which was, I wanted this to be a good book for a reader, not necessarily for me. You know what I mean? I know how deep I can go, but sometimes when people know too much about Star Wars, it becomes isolated,
Yes.
and you exclude people who are, just familiar with it a little bit. And
Yeah,
I
it's
wanted
too
to
inside
do
baseball.
both, which is why there's two levels to this book. There's an original tale, which, and I say this not jokingly, it's true, but it's really the perfect book for any people who know nothing about Star Wars and for people who know everything about Star Wars.
Yeah.
We
that's a great
literally
way to
said
put it.
Because it
we
kind
said
of
that in
fills
our
the
review,
gaps.
actually.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Oh, that's great. So, like I said, I got away from your question, but
it's okay.
I had a whole list of places I wanted to go and things I wanted to see and explore. Most of them got trimmed down on my own. There were a few that Story Group, if you're not familiar with it, Lucasfilm has what's called Story Group, and those are like the team of people who oversee everything, so they know what's happening in the movies and the cartoons and the comics and the video games and all that stuff, so that there's no repetition or no conflict.
That's Kerry
And there were
Hart's
like
team,
one
right?
or two things that they said not do that.
Nice. Can you elaborate on any of what those things they said nope were, or is that something we just have to leave to our imaginations?
Well, yeah. There's a story, in case you haven't heard it. I pitched this story to them for a while, and it took about a year for them to greenlight. And then when they called, they said, good news, we're greenlighting this story. I was like, fantastic. And they said, now we need it in 3 months. And I was like, 3 months? I was like, I'm talking about like 90,000 word novel. And they're like, so are we. And I was like, you're asking the impossible, which of course I then realized is the exact line that Luke says to Yoda when he's training him. And I was like, oh, it's coming back up to me. But I kill myself to get them a first draft. I'd say realistically about 4 months. But I handed it in. I'm like, okay, phew, good, I'm happy. And they call for a notes call about before Christmas of, I guess, 2018. And they said, well, we have a problem we didn't foresee happening. And I was like, what? They said, somehow, without knowing it, you inadvertently wrote a big section of episode 9.
What?
And I was like, what? And I said, well, clearly you got me on the wrong gig. I should be writing the movie. And we all laughed, and then they said, yeah, anyway, you got to change it.
Whoa.
So I did have to go back, and I can say now what it was. For the longest time I couldn't. But in my original draft, Carr went back to Endor to find parts of the Death Star that may have been embedded in the rock.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, my God, that's so cool.
That's sick.
He would get visions from that, and then another thing that he also did was he found a Sith relic.
I like that too.
And
yeah, man, you had an
and
episode
so
9
those
written.
Things, they were like, this is, I know, and they were like, so you got to redo that, and I was like, oh, you're kidding me.
Oh.
But like I said to you earlier, it didn't change the arc of Carr's journey or Maze's or RZ7. Because this story is kind of a road trip story. It just kind of cut back on the places and the number of places that they went. So luckily that was the structure of the story to begin with. But yeah, that was some of the things that they were like, no, can't do that. And there was one or two things I won't mention because I'd like to think we can do a follow-up book.
Oh, please.
Ooh,
And I may
yes, please.
save some of them for that. So we'll see.
That works.
See. We got to
Yeah.
get to this Corona thing first.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, like I think I want to say this is our first look at the planet Kijimi, which we ended up getting in episode 9. But I think this was the public's first chance to get a read on Kijimi. So it was very cool seeing that as like
Yes,
a little preview. So I don't know
absolutely.
if that was related to that episode 9 section that you had to alter. But
Now, did you take Kijimi from episode 9, or did they take episode
yeah.
9 take Kijimi from you? Which
Well,
came
yeah.
first?
I took it from them.
Okay.
Okay.
Because this is an episode, a Journey to Episode 9 book, they said, all right, we'll give you some things that are coming up in Episode 9. But also, without giving away the ending, I also think this, people have said to me, this book makes them revisit all the other movies and stories from a different point of view. And that makes me really happy. And I think that's another reason why it's considered a Journey to Episode 9 as well.
for sure.
For sure, man. I mean, the Claudia Gray novel, Leia, Princess of Alderaan, tagged into stuff in episode 8, and that's set like 40 years ahead. So this totally makes sense with that whole thing. So I had a question, and I forgot what it was. Your writing distracted me.
No, my bad.
Do you remember?
Taking notes. Taking notes, man. I don't know. It's just interesting, the process. You had certain locations already selected. They had to kind of narrow down yourself, and then also, of course, with the help from the story group. So those two things alone are just kind of mind-blowing, because the way you said it makes you kind of appreciate the rest of canon, whether it's TV shows or movies. It really made me think, too, just all the connections that there are within every story of Star Wars. Like, all the characters really are connected in some way, shape, or form. And I think that goes along with the message of Star Wars, how the Force connects everybody. So just those
Absolutely.
connections were huge to me.
Absolutely.
Now, the specific.
And I will say,
go ahead. No,
you
go
know,
ahead. Go ahead, please.
George gets I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
You want me to go?
Yeah, go
Okay.
ahead, please.
You know, George gets obviously a lot of flack for the prequels, and I have to confess, I've had some criticism of them as well and stuff like that. But in doing this, you realize the expanded universe that he created, and it is mind blowing, because I can't think of any other, I'll call it an IP to be technical, but that has expanded so greatly. There are people who complain like, oh, when Obi-Wan says, the Clone Wars, I liked it just imagining what they were. We didn't need to see them. But he has just created so much that it is vast. And to be honest, I had to remind myself what the average viewer knew. Now,
Yeah.
I, as big a Star Wars fan as I am, I forgot for a moment, or I took it for granted. We all know that the Emperor implanted the clones with something that made them not be able to resist Order 66. And for some reason in my head, we learned that in Revenge of the Sith, and we didn't.
No.
You know what I mean?
It's only in the Clone Wars show.
They gave the order, and they all turned on them.
Mhm.
But it was kind of like, oh, yeah, wait a minute. People don't know that unless you're a diehard.
Yeah.
It's one of those things
so
when
it
you're a
was
fan,
important
everything's
for
kind of
me,
meshes together.
There were a couple of yeah, and it was important for me to get a few challenges that I had. One was I wanted Carr. I didn't want him to seem dumb by any imagination, because he's not. But I also had to make sure that the answers were just far enough out of his reach. We had a whole discussion. I don't know why exactly. Oh, I understand now why. But like, if you look at the cover of the book, Carr is holding a Stormtrooper helmet from A New Hope.
Yep.
And at some point, and that's the first chapter, and you discover that, why he has it and whatnot. I don't think I explained exactly why on an earlier draft, and they kept saying, just make it a clone trooper helmet. That would make more sense, because he's trying to figure out the jet. And I said, you can't. I said, because if he touches a clone trooper helmet, the game's over.
Yeah.
He has a vision of the clone troopers who worked with the Jedi, so he now knows they're real, and he now knows that they killed them. I said, there's no journey there, and I'm not saying that they were ignorant of that. It's just that I think they didn't see how I was laying out the pieces. And so what I had to do then was describe why he was looking after that Stormtrooper helmet in particular, and I went on to elaborate that, one of his, Janu Blen, I think, had a great-grandfather who claimed that he had been influenced by a Jedi on Tatooine, so he had to get that helmet and all this stuff. So it just added for more backstory, which I loved. But it was funny to me how I was like, yeah, there are certain objects I can't have him come into contact with right off the bat.
Yeah, that makes total
and
sense.
So it becomes like a trail of breadcrumbs.
Oh, dude,
Yeah.
that's I wouldn't even thought about that. And
No.
that's so you're so right. He couldn't have touched that because he would have known 100% off the jump like what was going on.
Like, and some of that just comes
exactly.
from like our so little knowledge of psychometry, the force power that Carr has.
Mm-hmm.
Now we see Quinlan Voss have it in the Clone Wars, and now in Fallen Order, that main
Correct.
character Cal
Yeah.
Kestis has it, and possibly Kylo and
Right.
Rey. We don't know for sure, but like our knowledge of the force power psychometry that you used so beautifully, like, is what makes all that so hard to write and hard to even understand from a reading standpoint, but not the way that you described it and not the way that you utilized it. It all fit perfectly and was very organic, and it was well done. I just like loved how you took
that's
that,
great. Thanks.
because it's such a hard thing to do.
Yeah, it's one thing we talk about this all the time because some of the newer films, you know, especially Last Jedi, come under fire with like, you know, showing new force powers, and you know, with like we call it force FaceTime between Kylo Ren
Right.
and Rey, and I'm always
Yes.
like, okay, well then we've done this exercise on the show. I'm like, okay, well then you come up with a new force power and have it make sense. Yeah. And it's really, really hard to do that.
We just sat there and like looked at each other like, I
It's
can't
true.
think
no
of
idea.
one.
It's
Yeah.
very true, you know. You don't want it to be ridiculous, and you want it to be realistic, you know what I mean? And what's so funny is this whole thing came to me a little bit when, you know, I used to host a show called Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego, and that was all about history. And I'm a bit of a history nut.
I grew up watching
And
that.
so while watching, what'd you say?
I grew up watching that show all the time. So
Oh, you're kidding.
yeah,
Oh,
no, I know
Yeah,
exactly
I
what
did
you're
too,
talking
man.
about. Yeah.
I did too. I love that show.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, it always threw me when in Force Awakens, Rey says to Han Solo, you know, were they real? Were they, you know, we thought these were stories. And I thought to myself, why does she not know? I mean, this is their history.
Mm-hmm.
This is a galactic war. Why are there certain aspects that are uncertain? And it dawned on me that, and I tried to put it back on myself and our own culture, and I thought, well, ask anybody about any of our own world wars, like even World War II or Civil War. You know, we know the players and we know who won, but there are so many other pockets we don't know. And then you see stories or hear, you know, like a Dunkirk or a Schindler's List or even Glory with the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And there are massive amounts of stories that shed light on unknown factors about whether it's troops or a certain adventure or, you know, something that turned the tide, which we're only now realizing. And I thought, well, that would make sense if this character Carr was from, like, you know, maybe an inner city version of a planet, and, you know, his history books are not the most up to date. And the other cross section I did with this was, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the lost city of the lost colony of Roanoke in Virginia.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And if you're not, I'll tell your if your listeners are not, it was about, you know, early stages of America when colonists came over from England. There was a group that settled in Roanoke, Virginia, and they were very low on supplies. And so their leader said, I'm going to leave. It was about 100 people in that colony, and he left his wife and his daughter and everybody behind, and he went back and got supplies. And in those days, it took about a year or so. And when he came back, they were all gone, just gone. And there's really, to this day, it's a mystery as to what happened. And there's some theories, and some people thought that they moved north. Some people thought they were killed by Native Americans. Who knows what? But it dawned on me that from a history point of view, that's kind of what happened to the Jedi.
Yeah.
Because if you're a scholar of the Jedi and you're following their history, every one of them mysteriously disappear on the same date. And that just seemed too juicy to gloss over. And I thought, that almost makes them sound like they were made up. You know, like maybe now that right when the Clone Wars ended, we got rid of the idea of the Jedi because we didn't need them anymore. You know, or why did they all disappear on one day? So those two, intertwining history with Star Wars was something I was really interested in doing. And if anything, I was trying to get people excited about their own history by reading Star Wars history.
That's awesome, man. We always say that, like, we have to and I think this is a brilliant move with the book because you've said before, like what does the average fan or the casual fan is kind of what we call them. Casual fans know. Not everyone in that universe knows what happened. And that's what's so fascinating looking from like outside of the Star Wars. Like we're observers inside this universe, so we know everything that what happened. But it's interesting that there are characters inside this universe that don't know what went on, and I've always found that very interesting. That's one. I think it's one of the reasons why I loved Carr so much, because he embodies that. Like you're watching this kid. It's almost like watching somebody watch the movies for the first time. Like I remember when I showed my kids the movies for the first time, like watching their face, like that. Wait, Darth Vader's his father, and you're like, yeah. Like it's one of those kind of moments.
Yeah, I know.
Awesome.
I showed my daughter all three of them when she turned, I think, 9. I wanted her to be the age I was when I at least saw the first one, and I did the same thing. You know, her 3 takes were from Star Wars. She said, "You should have warned me about those sand people," which was funny because I think that was my takeaway when I saw they scared the bejesus out of me when they shows up in front of Luke, and then. In Empire, when the Emperor shows up, she turned to me and said, "Well, Darth Vader is no longer the scariest person in this movie." Not fair enough. And then what I didn't see coming was she was practically inconsolable when Yoda died in Return of the Jedi. And I kept trying to tell her, like, he comes back. He's a Force ghost. But it didn't matter. She was she was devastated that he died. And I thought, well, that's a good character then.
Anytime I even hear that music cue, I tear up a little bit. So I understand
that.
Me too,
man. Me too.
And
oh my gosh!
I don't want to keep hogging all that.
Go ahead. When I watch Empire, and just the way that shot is set up, and then Obi-Wan says that boy was our only hope, and then right when the engines roar, Yoda says, "No, there is another." I still get goosebumps. I got them just now, and I
Oh, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. It sounded like it cut out there for a second.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. No, you're good. You're good.
No,
you're good.
I'm here.
Yeah, dude. I love like I've said it 3 times already on this, but I love the idea that there are characters that didn't know what happened. Like I think that is so fascinating, and there's so much you can do with the idea of that story that Force Collector I feel like now the book did such a good job of it. Like it would be kind of like someone's doing an impression of this book if they did that story kind of again, because it was just so good. And
the way you even convinced...
I appreciate that.
Like, you even had Carr's great-grandfather. No, his grandfather. Nakmed. Nakmed was convinced... his great-grandfather, that the Jedi had turned on the clones. And he used to be a Jedi. And he was convinced that the Jedi turned on the clones. It's like, that is a crazy thought in itself. And it makes sense in the universe.
I know. Well, you figure that was... Yeah, that's the propaganda. Yep. You know? I mean, that's the other thing I thought of. I said... end of Revenge of the Sith and Order 66, and then the Emperor goes and tells everybody that the Jedi rose up against him and he had to put them down.
Mm-hmm.
Now we wait 30 years, Return of the Jedi comes, we know the good guys win. But the Jedi didn't have any PR people. Nobody went back and corrected that history.
I mean,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there is a handful of people, they're probably grandparents at this point, who are prejudiced against the Jedi. And that's why I wanted to go back to that first planet we stop at and in the antique store, because this guy's a full-on fan of the clones because his dad was one, you know, and it's like sometimes your opinion of something is, of course, colored by what your family thinks or what your relatives think. And I just thought there must be so many different opinions about the Jedi, especially because no one ever went back and said, hey, guys, they didn't do this. They were good, you know. So that was another opportunity to go back and kind of try and, as you said, people who don't know the full story, because there are people who don't know the full story in our own lives.
Yeah.
You know, and especially in this day and age that we're living in, it's like, you know, of fake news or whatever you want to call it. It's just kind of like you have to do your own research. You have to learn your own facts. You can't just take things for face value because everybody has an opinion. You've got to get your own.
Mm-hmm.
Well said, my friend. Well said.
We see the same kind of effects take place with Leia when people find out she's connected to Vader.
Yep.
So it's that same idea and same train of thought.
Exactly.
Yep. Now, just as a Star Wars,
that's total sense to me.
Yeah. Just as a Star Wars fan, what is your favorite Star Wars book before you got into the writing for this book? Well, I guess you did Chewing the Porks before that, but as far as novels go.
Because. Yeah, no. I mean, look, I'm old, I remember when Timothy Zahn first came out with Heir to the Empire, and it was you were just so desperate for more Star Wars. It was like, this is the greatest, and it was, and I loved his books. There have been stories along the way that I loved. I think Rise of, I can't remember what the actual title is, but The Rise of Vader was a great one. I just finished reading one. I'm not sure how long ago it came out. It was called Tatooine Ghost, which I liked, which is it's Leia kind of coming to terms with the fact that her father wasn't just a monster, but that he had a life before he became Darth Vader.
Ooh.
And I thought it was a really interesting read. And then bringing it up to speed, I thought Claudia did a fantastic job with Lost Stars.
Oh, such a good book.
So just, there are so many good books out there, and I haven't read all of them, obviously, but those are just some ones I picked along the way that I loved enjoying them. Oh, and you know what? And also, it's Legends now, but Heir to the Empire was such a fun read in the, I guess it was early '90s or something when it came out. But yeah, I lose myself in these books. I have such a good time with them, and now, fortunately, we get a lot of them. That's why, to be asked to write one, I was beside myself, and I knew I had to be up for the task, and I wanted to be up for the task. And as a fan, I wanted to enjoy this book too. So, like I said before, it really makes me happy to hear how much you liked it, because that's all you want to do when you're writing a book, is to have someone enjoy it as much as you're enjoying it.
Oh, it was great, man. Now, I really hope with this new High Republic stuff that's all going on, I hope you're involved in some way, because you have a very unique and practical way of looking at the Star Wars universe that I love Claudia Gray. But I'm telling you, man, I think you have an even better handle on characters that we may or may like. I think you have a better way of expanding the universe, but it feeling natural, if that makes any sense. You have a better way of pushing these characters out and making them feel realistic and grounded, but also fitting into this universe.
Well, I appreciate that, and look, everybody's had to take a pause because of this whole Corona thing, but we had talked about possibly doing a follow-up to Force Collector. At the moment, I was not involved with the High Republic. I think I was working on Force Collector when they were, brainstorming that. But I'm hoping to continue to work with these guys in many different ways and shapes and forms. So I really appreciate that, because I will definitely take that moving forward.
I hope you do. Hope something happens. Hope somebody falls out so we can get a book from you on the High Republic, because that would make me very interested in it, because it's one of the things I'm not super interested in. I know that's kind of weird, but I'm always a fan of going forward versus going back, because I feel like eventually, no matter what you do, everything has to come to a certain conclusion. And I think I'm talking about when you're going back, but when you're going forward, you can kind of expand and keep expanding. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like Force Collector so much. But if you have a few minutes, we're going to get into some listener questions. We reached out to our listeners and had people ask you some questions. Unless there's something that you guys wanted to bring up before that, I'm totally for it.
Hi, Kevin. So I was just curious, how did, we're big Star Wars Galaxy's Edge fans here. So I'm just wondering how Batuu made it into the book. I know you said there were a lot of places that you were hoping to go. So how did Batuu get figured into the book?
Well, what's funny is I laugh when I'm talking to them about it, because it seems like the Star Wars Galaxy is filled with antique collectors and junk finders and places to buy and sell these things. But when this was coming about, it just so serendipitously came together where, we have Galaxy's Edge, and it was coming out, and Lucasfilm suggested it. They said, may we suggest him going to Galaxy's Edge, to Batuu and all this. And I was like, oh, that would be perfect, because you do want what you said before about, what I try and do, and history is usually my way in, but I try and make these characters and these stories relatable. Yes, they're happening in a galaxy far, far away, but, you and I could have also experienced these things. And to be able to rope in someplace that you can actually visit here on this planet made me incredibly happy, because it became very concrete and tangent. I went there and I checked it out, and it all made sense, and it helped give life more to the characters while they were there. And so while they gave me Batuu, I happily accepted it because it was, without calling it out, is exactly what I needed. If that makes any sense.
It makes, I mean, Doc Ondar, that character, makes total sense, especially when you see what they did with him in the comic books and that kind of stuff. It makes total sense that he would play a part in Force Collector.
Absolutely. It was, I think it was a pleasant surprise. And now every time I go to Doc Ondar's and Galaxy's Edge, I feel like it's like the perfect place for a Force Collector. So I'm definitely going to think of the book.
Definitely.
I know. I love some people have tweeted me after the last movie came out. Well, I don't want to any spoilers, but when Ray buries a certain couple of things at the end, they were like, "Oh, I want Carr to go and dig those up."
I know.
You and I both.
Dude,
you and I both.
If that's not how Force Collector 2 starts, I'm gonna be very disappointed.
No, I love that idea for sure.
Oh, dude, could you
Well,
imagine?
there's a lot of hoops you got to jump through. It's a lot of not politics. It's a lot of, like I said, you're writing a little bit in a vacuum because you don't know what's happening, and Story Group does. There were some characters I was going to use that they say, I wouldn't go there, and they won't tell you why. Even when I had written a big section of episode 9, I said, well, can you tell me what I wrote? And they were like, you'll be able to piece it together from the notes. And I was like, they wouldn't even come out and tell me outright.
That's hilarious. People
and
working in Star Wars
okay,
are not
all
telling.
Right. But
that's nuts,
I know,
man.
I
That's
know.
crazy.
I'll tell you a funny story. How secret they are. I'm also a voice actor, and I worked on, as I told you, Star Wars Detours. The months go by, and my agent calls and says, you have an audition for this project. It was very secretive what it was. I was like, all right, great. So I went in, and I swear, I kid you not, I had read it at least once, and it was going for a second take before it dawned on me, not only was it Star Wars Detours, it was the script, one of the scripts I wrote. But they had changed it so much so that no one knew what it was, that even I, the writer,
That's hilarious.
it was so bizarre. I was like, guys, wait, what's the matter? I'm like, I wrote this. I was like, I know exactly what this is. They were like, well, keep your mouth shut. I was like, all right.
That's funny. Mm-hmm. I've always wondered, like, if it's as secret as it seems, and it sounds like it is. I mean, the fact that, like, nothing got leaked from the Mandalorian set is just insane to me. That, like, none of that got leaked is crazy.
I know. It's crazy. You know what's crazy to me is, when did it come out? The fact that as early, or as late, I should say, when did, was it Force Awakens, or I forget when, all of a sudden we were seeing online and on the DVD extra footage of Luke making his own lightsaber from Return of the Jedi.
Yeah,
I thought
that
is some patience, because if George is sitting on that,
right?
He's already released the Ultimate set. He's already released the limited edition. He's already released so much. The wherewithal to hold on to some stuff to be like, you know what? Not yet.
Oh, I
and
know.
I was like, jeez. It was incredible.
I'm hoping we someday get the story of, it's never going to happen in a million years, but I'm holding out hope that one day we get the behind the scenes of what happened with the Colin Trevorrow and the J.J. Abrams thing, because that's super interesting to me, and I think they made the right decision, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of the sequel trilogy. To me, The Last Jedi for me is my second favorite Star Wars movie. I just think it's everything.
I love Last Jedi.
Oh, it's so good, man. It's so good. It's one of those things where I just always go it's not what you thought it would be in the best way possible.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I was disappointed when all the backlash came out, too. And it's like, look, in this day and age, you're not going to please everyone.
No.
Even my own book, all you can do as a writer is write the best book you think you can make. And I guarantee you, I can go out today and find 10 people who love this book and 10 people who hate this book. It's just inevitable. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's not about, and that's something I learned working with George, too. What's incredible is we forget that at his core, George is an experimental, independent filmmaker.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he has succeeded so often puts us in a false understanding that he's always there to please us. And so when he takes a step that we don't agree with, we go off on him. But he's not in it for that. He's in it for pushing boundaries and trying new things and experimenting with different things. And some days we're going to like them, and some days we're going to not. but it doesn't. It almost doesn't matter. It's the experience of him giving us something new. I know that has been a criticism of his. Sometimes these new ones don't offer enough newness, but you forget that's every time a movie came out, he showed us something we hadn't seen before, and that's why. Even in writing this book, it had to be like, look, I have a vision in mind. I'm going to do my best to execute it as best I can. I hope I do it. And my only judge really is myself, because I know what the vision was. And I feel I came pretty close in terms of, like, when this started, it was a bigger book, a bigger scope. We went to different places, but all things considered, Carr's arc and his journey have remained the same. And that's what I hold on to.
That's great, man.
I forget how we got on that, but that's where we
no,
are.
dude, that's great. I think the people who asked these questions liked the book, because we have a few questions here from our listeners once we told them that you were coming on the show today. And I want to get to these because some of these are pretty good. Some of these we kind of covered a little bit, and we'll just kind of gloss over them again if we have. But first one up is from @JollyCaucusRace. It's a weird name. What was your favorite artifact for Carr to discover? Were there any others you considered or got edited out? That's the first part.
What were the three that he discovered? Artifacts?
Yeah, what was your favorite artifact for Carr to discover? Were there any others you considered or got edited out?
Let me think. I'm trying to think if I had any edited. There was certainly, to be honest, when we started, I'm trying to remember where I was. And I know I wanted him, what was most exciting to me was, I mean, all of it, I was seeing it through his eyes. So, like, when he found the training orb, I was excited to flash back to A New Hope, and I really loved that moment. But what I was adding to it was when he found that Sith saber, and I was kind of like, I was excited for that. And as readers will know, there's kind of a surprise ending with that. But that was something that was key to me, because I wanted him to see something that scared him. This book is it's not your typical book where there's like a good guy and a bad guy. Because it's a kind of coming of age book, your own demons in many ways are the bad guys. And so I didn't feel the need to have, a actual person like after him, because I thought there was enough there that he was running from, and that saber really played into it. So I would say that's my favorite artifact that he found. I'm trying to think, other than having to take out pieces of the Death Star, because what excited me about that was I wanted, at some point, I think if I remember correctly, I wanted him to have the Stormtrooper helmet at some point was going to belong to one of the troopers who handed Luke over to Darth Vader on Endor. And that was going to be a big moment because as you know, we're eking this information out for Carr. First is, did they even exist? And then he finds out they existed, but why did they all end on 19 BBY? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then after that, it was the realization that a Jedi, or maybe more than one Jedi, existed later in life was huge. And I still have that in the book, but I was going for a fact where he saw from the trooper's helmet a trooper handing Luke over to Vader. So that was an artifact that I had to change it, but that was something I wanted to do. We still have that moment where he realizes that Jedi existed after their death date, but that's the original form of that.
Gotcha. I remembered earlier when I said I forgot what I was going to ask you. I remembered what it was. It wasn't a question; it was more of a comment. The Skywalker reveal is brilliant.
It is.
It might be my favorite part of the
He's
entire
confused if it's Luke or Anakin because he doesn't know. He thinks they're one person.
Yeah. Well, I thought that would make sense because I was like, if he's getting these visions out of order, and it's like you see the same Kenobi you hear Kenobi and Skywalker constantly. Why would you assume that they would be different?
Yeah.
And so you're like, okay, well, I guess he's training with him first, and then he becomes a general, and then I thought, no, you just got. I borrowed from. I was inspired by a lot from Citizen Kane because I thought, well, look, it's in some way you're setting out to learn something. How do you do this? Well, you go and you start talking to people. And if they lead you to something, you go to another person, or you go to an artifact, you go to whatever. And so to be able to piece this puzzle together, Mike Siglain, who was my publisher on this, kept saying, like, it kept reminding him of Memento, you know, putting certain things,
Yes.
so you're getting them out of order. You've got to make sense to them. And I was like, yeah, you're right. It does kind of feel like that. So I'm glad you appreciate that.
Oh, it's awesome. All right, this person has one last question here, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, so you can answer as vaguely as you need to. Lastly, how close did you work with the screenwriters of The Rise of Skywalker, especially in regards to Chewie and Maz at the end? Thanks.
Not at all. As I said, you kind of write in a vacuum. I talked with, you know how it happened? I think it was I wanted something, obviously, and again, spoilers for this, but I needed something that Carr could touch that would fill him in on the whole history of the Jedi, right? So at first I said to them, gee, wouldn't it be great if I could get Anakin's lightsaber? You know, even Maz says in Force Awakens, how'd you get that? Well, that's a story for another time. I'm like, well, let me be that time. Let me explain it.
Yes.
And they were like, no, you can't do that. And I was like, I
knew there's a reason that we liked you so much, because that's what I've been begging for. We have it now in comics, but that's what I've been begging for since 2015. Was no, that's a good question for now. I want to know now. Yeah. So I knew there's a reason we loved you so much.
Of course. So then I came up with the object that I do use in the book. But at first they were like, and this is not me complaining about them, because you can't do it without them, and they foresee things that you can't possibly know. But they were like, well, maybe it's two objects. Because at first they said, hey, would you, we have an idea. Let him touch the medal that Luke gets. And I was like, well, that doesn't help me. It doesn't give me the history of the Jedi. And then they were like, well, maybe it could be two things. And I was like, no. And so, to be honest, with Story Group, you don't really negotiate. You just sit there and let them either agree with you or disagree with you. So it's not a question of like, oh, hey, can I do this? It's a question of, did they cut it? You know what I mean? So for the longest time, I kept saying, all right, it's in there, it's still in there, it's still in there. So finally, I made an argument for the object that's in there, and they were like fine with it. But I love the idea of the medal, so I kept that in there as kind of a test that Maz uses to see if he really has these abilities before she gives him the object that she gives him. Awesome. So I didn't consult or talk to anybody who wrote the movie. But I knew there'd be some sort of play, because that was something else that we talked about in connection to our journey to Episode 9, if that makes any sense.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And that's perfect for Maz's character, that she would be inquisitive towards Carr, just to check on him, but also kind of like to pull a Yoda when Luke goes to Dagobah and meets Yoda, a little bit of mischievous about it. So that really fit Maz's character really
exactly.
Too.
Beautiful. All right.
You nailed it on the head. That was exactly what it is.
Beautiful. All right. The next question comes from @DisneyDad9. I'm always interested in who writers read. So who are your favorite authors and favorite books?
Good question. Well, Star Wars I've covered. I love the Timothy Zahns. I love Claudia. Forgive me for not remembering the people the authors who wrote like Tatooine Ghost and the other one, I think Rise of Vader. But those are the Star Wars one. I love Stephen King. He's a tricky one, because I love reading him, but sometimes, why it's not always a slam dunk when you bring him to the screen is he writes stuff that is almost unfilmable sometimes, which is what you should do if you're writing a book, because you should write towards the medium you're writing, and it's usually up to the director of whatever medium you're doing to either copy that or come up with his own idea. And I think that was only succeeded with Kubrick, in my mind. I know King doesn't like that movie. I think he's come around since then, but it's the only example I can truly give that he had to change the ending and then did something equally great. But I will say, because of that, this Force Collector also was inspired by the Dead Zone. In fact, that's how I pitched it to Disney, because I said it's Star Wars meets the Dead Zone. I said there's a character who gets these massive headaches when he touches certain things, and they show him visions that he doesn't quite understand, but then he will go to learn that he might have the Force or have some sort of connection to the Force. And they were really excited by that. So I have to say Stephen King is definitely up there with someone who inspired me to write this book.
That's awesome. That's a great pitch. How do you say no to that?
Yeah, it helped. It certainly helped in the beginning. They were like, "Ooh, I like that." So I was like, "Good."
All right.
And as he's more of a playwright, he's more of a playwright and a screenwriter. But Tom Stoppard, I'm a big fan of too. His works like Shakespeare in Love and other plays like Arcadia. There's a lot of history intertwined with fiction in those things. And if you haven't read those plays, I suggest going and read those too, because those are two really great ones.
Cool. I got homework now. All right.
See?
Moving on to the next question here. It comes from our friend David Albee at Narnian Jedi. And he says, 2 simple questions. What is your favorite planet in Star Wars?
Good question. Well, I always like Mustafar, and I wanted to go there at some point, but Tatooine is just so rich with possibilities. I know we're heading there a lot lately, but if you'll notice, they asked me to stay away from Tatooine in the book.
Makes sense with how Rise of Skywalker ended.
I almost couldn't. So that's why at some point he plans to go to Tatooine and then get sidetracked. But I had to have that in there because it's so ripe with everything we know, and our connection to Star Wars is the Skywalker family, and that's all about Tatooine. So I really, if you're looking for like research and historical stuff, I want to go to Tatooine. But other than that, I like the idea of Mustafar and what it stood for. A side note to this question is funny is when I wrote this book, I tried to capture something that I felt when I was like 8 when Star Wars A New Hope, then just called Star Wars, came out. And about a month before the movie came out, obviously, trailers started coming out on television. And you can imagine how it would just blow our minds. And there were so many images and great sequences. And yet, like any teaser, there wasn't really enough to piece together what the heck was going on. So I tried to piece it together on my own what Star Wars was. And according to that teaser, I surmised that there was a bad guy in black who kidnapped a princess, and there was a young guy who was trying to save her, but that the bad guy had her holed up in a castle in the desert, and that the Sand People were the protectors of that castle. And I guessed that Luke must have succeeded because that famous shot of them swinging over the chasm, I assumed they were exiting the castle. And in my mind, there might have actually been a moat right outside that door. You know what I mean? So in some ways, I was right. In some ways, I was very wrong. But I wanted to, with this book, capture the idea of trying to piece together Star Wars just on certain images that you can get and put them together like a puzzle. And so don't think that I wasn't giddy when later I found out that Darth Vader did have a castle on Mustafar. And I was like, so I wasn't so off. It wasn't on Tatooine, but he did have a castle. So I just felt redeemed with my young thoughts on that. That's why I think Mustafar holds a place of importance.
Nice. And the other question to this, we kind of touched on this a little bit too. Will there be a follow-up book to Force Collector?
Well, I hope so. The world's in a weird place. I know a lot of the printers are in China. There's a lot. But I would like to think that we will see these characters again in some way, shape, or form.
Disney Plus. Ooh,
that'd be cool.
Disney Plus.
Disney Plus.
That would be great.
Oh, yes.
Dude, I would love to see. Of all of the books, I think this one has the one that would adapt to. And this is not. And I don't know if you're going to take this in an offensive way. Please do not. I think it is the book that you could most adapt to like a Disney Plus series. You could adapt it to screen.
No, I
easiest.
agree. I totally agree.
I don't want you to be
totally
like,
agree.
it doesn't stand alone as a book. No, it definitely does. But it could also be
it
a
translates
great
well.
show.
It would definitely translate.
Yeah, well, please. I would love to see that. Whether it happens or not, I don't know. But these characters are very close to me. All three of them. Maze and RZ7 just as much. And I named Maze after my daughter Maisie. So in name alone, she's close to me. But I love that character so much. And I always find it's interesting when you pick up a Star Wars book to see how the author treats the droid. Not treats as in, treats them, but like how they interpret them. And so, I did my little spin on RZ7, and I was happy at how he came out. And as a result, I'm very fond of him. But I would love these characters to come to life, either again in another novel or in some other form. So we'll see. Start a campaign. We'll see how far we can get going with this.
We'll start it the second we hang up this interview. I
Hashtags.
wanted to ask you a question too. I meant to bring this up earlier. Are there like artist renderings of all these other characters? Because we have one of Carr on the front of the book.
No, but
are they anywhere?
Yeah, but people have no. Tony Foti was the artist who did the cover of the book. They asked me for some ideas for the cover, and I just said I wanted him covered in artifacts. And then Tony sent me like two different versions of what the cover could be, and I loved the one we went with. I love them both actually, but for some reason I thought this one was more dynamic. But there are not other versions. However, I've seen some fan art out there now, which makes me happy. So maybe we'll further down the line, if who knows if this becomes a comic book or if it becomes another novel or whatever, maybe we can see these things come to life in some way.
Comic would be great too. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, I mean, you really nailed RZ too. He's a perfect Star Wars droid.
It's all possible.
Well, we will see. I will wait with bated breath. All right, last question here, and then I will let you go. You've been more than generous with your time. Thank you very much.
Of course.
But the last question here comes from Dylan Insignogel. I don't know how to say that name. Sorry, at Captain Epic Fail 1. And he says, when another weird one. When Maz tells Carr that the path he saw in his vision wasn't his, was she telling him that it wasn't him he saw, or is it how Carr took it and he wasn't meant to take the Jedi path?
I think what he's asking, and I think the answer is, she was basically saying it's not the path you think you're following. Like, follow it, but I'm not saying it's not in your future to be exactly what you're thinking you are. So be open to interpretation, which is really what we can all do in life. We all have hopes and dreams, and we want to shoot for those things. And sometimes we can become close, and sometimes we realize that our path, look, I'll give you an example. I started out as an actor, and I always assumed I was just going to be an actor. And as my life went on and careers went on, I picked up writing as well and enjoyed it so much. And in some ways, I think I would have been a better actor if I didn't want it so much. You know what I mean? And for some reason, the writing took an even higher route because there was not the pressure that I put myself through as an actor. And so in some ways, it's as if Maz said to me, like, you're going to succeed in the entertainment world. It's just not going to be as you think it will be. And that's kind of how I think Maz was saying to Carr, this is not your journey. She was, you read about the Jedi. That is their story. And your story is part of them, but it's not exactly what you think it's meant to be, if that makes sense.
It's beautiful. I always took it as she was the same kind of thing, like, you're not going to be a Jedi. That doesn't mean you can't be important. The kind of the way that Maz is to the Jedi.
Yes. No, that's exactly what it's another way of saying what I just said. I'm hoping it is, because that is the truth. It's like I said, everybody has a role to play. You may not be, this didn't, you may not be a Jedi per se. You may not be the Jedi you want to. A lot of people join the army. They want to do their part, and then they wind up, serving in some different way. They're part of, clerical or whatever. Not the way they envisioned it, but they're still a part of the big picture. And I think that's what Maz is saying, which is you're part of the big picture. You're just not as specific as you think you will be.
That's beautiful. I love it. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining the show. Guys, if you want to check out his book, Force Collector, we obviously cannot recommend it highly enough. There will be a link in the description of this podcast down below to the Amazon page for this one and Chewie and the Porgs. I almost said Chewie versus the Porgs, which is just kind of how it turned out to be in Last Jedi.
I think I know win. Yes, and if anybody wants to follow me, it's at Kevin Shinnick on Twitter or on Instagram, and I usually have updates there that just kind of shoot you on my website, kevinshinnick.com, about whatever books are coming up or signings or comics. I got a couple other things in the works. I got a Spider-Man book coming out, Spider-Man comic book coming out.
I'll buy it. I got your back, dude. I'll support anything you do, man. You're fantastic. Do you plan on being at Celebration if it happens this year?
You know, I had, but I don't know if it's going to happen.
I know. I'm so nervous. I want it to happen so bad.
Fingers crossed.
I know. Me too. Well, if we all do wind up going, please find me out.
Absolutely.
For
we
sure.
will, man. Thank you so much for being on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it so much, dude.
Of
It's my
course.
favorite
Thanks
Star
for
Wars
having
book.
me.
Thank you so much.
That makes me. No, of course. Thank you, guys. It means so much how much you liked it. So thanks for having me on.
Of course, man. Anytime. You're the man.
Thanks. Talk to you.
See you, buddy. Bye.
Bye.